Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Alright, boys and girls, files of all shapes and sizes. I'm running behind. This is going to be late.
Oh, no, I can't, oh, there we go. You need to put it up a little bit higher.
There you go.
Yeah, bunny ears.
I like the gun better.
The gun?
There you go. And making me do the shout out.
Do the shout out!
Sorry, we're a little bit delusional, guys. Sorry. It's been a long day.
Delirious as fuck.
It's been a long day. I'm running behind, and I still have to put together the Wayback Wednesday. Maybe I should make Dad do the Wednesday. Anyway, we have all right, Neil. Okay, we got April, we got Ava, we got Barry. There's Generations. There's Black Beauty. There's Hippie. My Linda. There's Eddie and Trending and Elsie. There's Flirtkin coming from the back. Betty. LTN's running in the lead. Reverend Angel's currently dying. There's A Space. Don't die, Angel. Don't die. Don't die.
Yeah, there's hair.
Don't eat the hair. Oh my goodness. There's Blistering. Mr. Jamie's in the lead currently, but not for long. We got people right on his heels.
Sheena.
There's Sheena. There's Belle. There's Kylie. Shadow. We Were Coming. Crazy Train. 5Can. Podcast. Oh, I think it's going to be Jamie. Oh, no, Jamie's still behind. Here comes Love.
Oh, damn.
Oh, Love's going to do it. Love won.
With that ugly color.
Love won.
Wow.
All right, this is Love and Live. They are a couple's vlog. They do gaming. They're a very fun channel. This one's got some member celebration. Here's a song for the members. Point of view. Oh, lots of music on the regular videos. They got some shorts, which look like fun. Mostly, I kept members. There's family meeting. Oh, no, they can't. I like how you're just like, Mom, you're not showing them the channel.
I was just like, just let me fix it.
It's never fully on the channel.
Here's the short she was talking about. Here's the video she was talking about.
You expected to actually be able to see the channel. How dare you?
Yeah, because you weren't showing the fucking channel. You were showing half of the screen.
They only get to see this half. Or maybe this half. Depending on the day.
They didn't see the thumbnails or anything.
Anyway, check out Love and Live. And enjoy the video. Which is about a bunch of old people who came together at a conference to make decisions that no longer matter. Alright, fellows. The bearded historian has settled on his history lesson for today. I took some debating and discussion, and pictures are going to be interesting and creative. But you know what? Valentine's coming up, so you might just get Valentine's pictures.
There you go. Some happiness. Now, like we were discussing, there was a couple options that I had played with. Edison's birthday, Reynolds, even Anderson from Friends. You know, could have had a guest speaker.
What?
With Angel.
You'd have to talk her into it.
No. But the one event that happened was this was the rounding up, basically the end of the Yalta Conference in 1945. Give a little backstory on it. In 1943, the big three, Russia, America, and Britain, had met in Tehran, at that time an allied country, to try and work out plans as for how they were going to handle the three armies with World War II that was presently going on its fourth year. Well, this conference in Yalta was a little different because February 1945, a lot of things had changed on the map. First of all, we'd already landed on the beaches of Normandy.
Woo.
We cleared most of France and Belgium.
Woo.
We were basically knocking on the door of Germany, right across the Rhine. And the Russians, the Soviet Union, they were within, I think it was like 60 miles of Berlin when this conference finally wrapped up. Needless to say, the Russian mayor was just chewing up German units right to left. In the Pacific, things were still, we were engaged in what's known as an island hopping campaign.
Hop, hop, hop.
And it worked out pretty good. You know, what we would do is we would take key strategic islands, leave others completely alone, and they would starve to death. Basically, they couldn't, feed their own troops, and the locals weren't going to spare their food. You guys invaded us. You didn't bring any food. Heaven forbid.
No. Why would I bring my own food?
Now, Yalta, for the map seekers out there, is located in the Crimean Peninsula. It's a little place in the Black Sea. The thing I do find funny about it is that the Germans during World War II, they shelled the heck out of the Crimean Peninsula trying to capture it. They were blowing up fortresses. They were bringing in great big cannons that could launch large projectiles. There's all these labyrinth catacombs underneath a couple of these fortresses, and the people that were defending them finally, if it wasn't for a couple of cheapskates, the Germans figured out, we'll just seal them up and you guys can suffocate. Nice Germans.
Nice Germans.
It took them a couple months to actually capture the cities of Sevastopol, and the Russians basically overran it in about a week. But then again, the Germans were just tripping over themselves trying to get out of there. I mean, the way the Russian army had advanced from Stalingrad across the Russian plain, they broke the siege up in Leningrad. Yeah, it was not turning out very pretty for the Germans at all. Now, what would wind up happening, you had Franklin Delano Roosevelt from America, you had Winston Churchill out of England, and you had Joseph Stalin out of the Soviet Union. And, there were a lot of people that had some questions, looking at the way to shape a post-war peace that would represent not only collective security, but also a plan to give self-determination to the liberated people of Europe. Mostly it was designed mainly to discuss the reestablishment of the nations of war-torn Europe within a few years, and it would also sadly usher in what was known as the Cold War, dividing the continent between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces. And again, it was the second of three major wartime conferences. Shortly after Yalta in July of 1945 followed the Potsdam Conference, and then of course there was also a conference in Moscow in October 1944. Roosevelt was unable to attend this one, but Churchill and Stalin had reached kind of an informal agreement about Western and Soviet spheres of influence in Europe.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, at the time, as we were mentioning, the Western Allies had taken care of France and Belgium, fighting on the western border of Germany. In the east, the Soviet forces, pardon my calculations, 65 kilometers, that's only 40 miles from Berlin. They'd gone back. The Germans had been pushed from Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. There's no longer really a question of when the Germans were going to if the Germans were going to be defeated. It was a question of how the new shape of post-war Europe was going to play out. Now, also interesting is that the French leader, Charles de Gaulle, was not invited to either the Yalta or the Potsdam Conference,
How sad.
diplomatic slight that was the occasion for deep and lasting resentment. De Gaulle would attribute this exclusion from Yalta to the long-standing personal antagonism towards him by Roosevelt, but the Soviets had also objected to his inclusion as a full participant. However, with the absence of the French representation also meant that extending an invitation for de Gaulle to attend the Potsdam Conference would have been highly problematic, since he would have felt honor-bound to insist that all issues agreed at Yalta in his absence be reopened. Kind of like opening a can of worms and then going, "Ooh, look, fish bait."
I like fish bait.
Yeah. Now, the initiative for calling a second conference had come from Roosevelt, who hoped the meeting before the U.S. presidential elections in November 44, but pressed for a meeting early in 45 at a neutral location in the Mediterranean. Options existed like Malta, Cyprus, Sicily, Athens, Jerusalem, but Stalin, insisting his doctors opposed any long trips, rejected the options. He proposed instead for them to meet at the Black Sea resort of Yalta in the Crimea. Stalin had a fear of flying, also as a contributing factor in this decision. So let's throw a couple guys on the submarine.
Woo!
Catchy. Now, each of the three leaders had their own agenda for the post-war Germany and liberating Europe.
How dare they?
I know. And like I said, they were playing chess, basically. Roosevelt wanted Soviet support in the Pacific War against Japan, specifically for the planned invasion of Japan. At that time, it was known as Operation August Storm, as well as Soviet participation in the United Nations. Churchill pressed for free elections and democratic governments in Central and Eastern Europe, specifically Poland. Stalin demanded a Soviet sphere of political influence in Eastern and Central Europe as an essential aspect of Soviet national security strategy, and his position at the conference was felt by him to be so strong that he could dictate terms. According to the United States delegation member and future Secretary of State, James F. Burns, it was not a question of what we would let the Russians do, but what we could get the Russians to do. Now, part of this I kind of cringe at, because Poland was the first item on the Soviet agenda. For those of you who've watched some of our clips, the Soviet Union were just absolutely brutal to the Polish people. These are the same guys who pulled off what's known as the Katyn Massacre. They took out high-ranked people, they took out politicians, they took out businessmen, they separated them out, and then they shot them. Just, marched them into the Katyn forest and executed them. And then, to make matters worse, when the Germans invaded, they came across these bodies and was like, ooh, look, we could prove the Soviets were butchering Polish nationals. And it was kind of a bloody black eye for the Allied sides, because, Stalin, you're not behaving.
Aww.
But, at the same time, you're like, now they want to try to think that they're going to be nice with Poland. What's crazy is that Stalin stated, for the Soviet government, the question of Poland was one of honor and security, because Poland had served as a historical corridor for forces attempting to invade Russia. Oh, and don't forget the fact that after Germany invaded from one side, who hit them from the back side? That would be the Soviet army.
No.
Heaven forbid. Now, in addition, Stalin would state regarding history that because the Russians had greatly sinned against Poland, the Soviet government was trying to atone for those sins. Really? You mean brutalizing them, killing civilians, occupying their country, and then stopping your forces before Warsaw had the uprising? Yeah, if I was the Polish, I don't think I'd want anything to do with you guys.
What?
That's just, personal opinion.
Oh, that's rude.
Yeah. Now, the Soviet government was trying to atone for these sins and concluded that Poland must be strong and that the Soviet Union is interested in the creation of a mighty, free, and independent Poland. Right. Accordingly, Stalin stipulated that the Polish government in exile demands were not negotiable and the Soviets would keep the territory of eastern Poland that they had annexed in 1939, with Poland to be compensated for that by extending its western borders at the expense of Germany. So we'll eat all this over here, and we'll give you nibbles of Germany.
Ooh, I like nibbles.
Anybody else think that Stalin was a butthead?
Oh, they're all buttheads.
Yeah. Now, back to Roosevelt. Roosevelt wanted the Soviets to enter the Pacific War against Japan with the Allies, which he hoped would end the war sooner and reduce American casualties. Now, you gotta realize, at this time, nobody knew about our secret weapon.
No?
No. The Russians, the British, nobody. It was still being played with out there in the desert. Now, one Soviet precondition for the declaration of war against Japan was an American official recognition of the Mongolian independence from China. The Mongolian People's Republic had been a Soviet satellite state from 1924 to World War II. The Soviets also wanted the recognition of Soviet interests in the Chinese Eastern Railway and Port Arthur, but not asking the Chinese to leave. The Soviets wanted the return of the South Sakhalin Island, which had been taken from Russia by Japan in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and the cession of the Kuril Islands by Japan, both of which were approved by the other Allies. In return, Stalin pledged that the Soviet Union would enter the Pacific War 3 months after the defeat of Germany. So they were already making the plan. As soon as Germany capitulated, then we'll go help the Americans.
Ah.
Now, interestingly enough, the fate of Korea is not mentioned in the records of the demands and concessions at Yalta. However, several declassified documents later revealed that on the 8th of February, while Churchill was not present, Roosevelt and Stalin secretly discussed the peninsula. Roosevelt brought up the idea of putting Korea into a trusteeship divided among the Soviets, the Americans, and the Chinese for a period of 20 to 30 years. He expressed reluctance to invite the British into the trusteeship, but Stalin replied that the British would most certainly be offended. In fact, the Prime Minister might kill us.
No.
Roosevelt agreed with the assessment. They were kind of scared of Churchill. You get that clue?
Why would he be upset?
I don't know. I'm talking about him without him in the room, heaven forbid. Now, Stalin suggested the trusteeship be as short as possible. The two quickly agreed that their troops should not be stationed in Korea. Korea was not discussed again throughout the conference. Furthermore, the Soviets agreed to join the United Nations because of a secret understanding of a voting formula with veto power for permanent members of the Security Council, which ensured each country could block unwanted decisions. Now, the Soviet army had occupied Poland completely and in much of Eastern Europe with a military power 3 times greater than the Allied forces in the West. The Declaration of Liberated Europe did little to dispel this sphere of influence agreements which had been incorporated into the armistice agreements. All 3 leaders ratified the agreement of the European Advisory Commission setting the boundaries for a post-war occupation zones for Germany, with 3 zones of occupation, 1 for each of the 3 principal allies. They also agreed to give France a zone of occupation carved out of the US and UK zones, but de Gaulle maintained the principle of refusing to accept that the French zone would be defined by boundaries established in his absence.
I mean, that's kind of fair.
Yeah. He thus ordered French forces to occupy Stuttgart in addition to the lands earlier agreed upon as comprising the French occupation zone. He only withdrew when threatened with the suspension of essential American economic supplies. You piss us off, we'll piss you off.
What?
Now, Churchill at Yalta then argued that the French also needed to be a full member of the proposed Allied Control Council of Germany. Stalin resisted that until Roosevelt backed Churchill's position, but Stalin still remained adamant that the French should not be admitted to full membership of the Allied Reparations Commission to be established in Moscow and relented only at the Potsdam Conference. Also, the Big Three agreed that the original governments would be restored to the invaded countries with the exceptions of Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland, whose governments in exile were also excluded by Stalin, and that all of their civilians would be repatriated. Oh, they're going to raise the dead for Poland.
Cool.
Right.
Can't do that?
Yeah, sadly they couldn't figure that out.
Oh, man.
Now, also of interest that there was discussions on the Middle East and the issue of Palestine, where Roosevelt supported the creation of a new Jewish state, believing that it would be a model of social justice and would raise the standard of living in the region over the opposition of King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. Roosevelt cited the views of Walter C. Loudermilk, and Palestine could absorb many millions more people. Prior to the conference, Secretary of State Edward Steitness Jr. urged Roosevelt not to make any decisions about Palestine without Soviet approval, as they might use it to gain influence in the Middle East, and instead try to win agreement from the British and the Soviets on a policy that considered the interests of both Arabs and Jews and avoid uncritical support of Zionism. However, at the conference, Stalin did not object to Roosevelt's goals, and Churchill gave him formal support in exchange for refraining discussions on the White Paper of 1939.
Okay.
Yeah, basically it's a bunch of undertakings. Sometime I had to just sit down and pull all the papers out on Palestine. Of course, we probably also have people arguing in the comments, but yeah. The Declaration of Liberated Europe was created by Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin during this Yalta Conference. It was a promise that allowed the people of Europe to create democratic institutions of their own choice. The Declaration pledged that the earliest possible establishment through free election governments responsive to the will of the people. This is similar to the statements of the Atlantic Charter for the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live. I'm sure Stalin was talking under his breath while they were reading this.
No.
Now, key points, as mentioned, were as follows. The agreement to the priority of the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. After the war, Germany and Berlin would be split into 4 occupied zones. Stalin agreed that France would have a 4th occupation zone in Germany if it was formed from the American and British zones. Don't touch our area. Germany would undergo demilitarization and denazification. At the Yalta Conference, the Allies decided to provide safeguards against a potential military revival of Germany, to eradicate German militarism in the Nazi General Staff, to bring about the denazification of Germany, to punish the war criminals, and to disarm and demilitarize Germany. German war reparations were partially to be in the form of forced labor. The forced labor was to be used to repair Germany that Germany had inflicted on its victims. However, laborers were also forced to harvest crops, mine uranium, and do other work. Creation of the Reparation Council would be located in the Soviet Union. There's already a few million captured POWs there. The status of Poland was discussed. The recognition of the communist provisional government of the Republic of Poland, which had been installed by the Soviet Union on a broader democratic basis, was agreed to. Quick note for anybody in the class, whenever they said Democratic Republic in Eastern Europe, it wasn't.
What?
Yeah. The Polish eastern border would follow the Curzon line, and the Poland would receive territorial compensation from the west from Germany. Stalin pledged to permit free elections in Poland. Roosevelt obtained a commitment by Stalin to participate in the United Nations. Now, Stalin requested that all of the 16 Soviet Socialist republics be granted UN membership. That was taken into consideration, but 14 republics were denied. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to membership for Ukraine and Byelorussian, while Roosevelt requested additional votes, with Churchill agreeing in principle and Stalin suggesting 2 additional votes as to be equal to the Soviet Union. The United States ultimately did not request more than 1 vote. Now, Stalin agreed to enter the fight against the Empire of Japan in 2 or 3 months after Germany had surrendered and the war on Europe was terminated. As a result, the Soviets would take possession of the southern Falkland and the Coral Islands, the port of Delaine would be internationalized, and the Soviet lease of Port Arthur would be restored, among other concessions. For the bombing of Japan, an agreement was reached on basing U.S. Army Air Force B-29s near the mouth of the Amur River in Komsomolsk-Novoselsk area, not near Vladivostok, which had earlier been proposed, but that did not eventuate. General Alexei Antonov also said that the Red Army would take the southern half of the Falkland Island as its first objective, and the American assistance to defend Kamchatka would be desirable. Now, Nazi war criminals who were found and put on trial in the territories in which the crimes had been committed, Nazi leaders were to be executed. A committee on the dismemberment of Germany was to be set up, and the purpose was to decide whether Germany was to be divided into several nations. Some of the example partitions, they showed actually 3 different varieties, and as most of us who have studied the history of mapping, I can understand cutting up Germany into its 4 major pieces. Of course, Poland got a hold of a couple extra pieces, but the thing is that it solved 2 or 3 problems. First of all, Germany at that time really didn't need a military because we were there. Sadly, East Germany didn't need them because the Soviets were there. And so thusly you started having the Cold War effect, and we basically prepped for a Soviet invasion through Germany, France, through Belgium, even though it never happened, but we planned for it. Of course, at the same time, we were also worried about later the fact that both sides eventually would have the bomb. Tons of fun. Now, the Big Three further agreed that democracies would be established. All liberated European and former Axis satellite countries would hold free elections, and that order would be restored. In that regard, they promised to rebuild occupied countries by processes that would allow them to create democratic institutions of their own choice. The Soviets never believed in democratic voting, but we're not supposed to believe that. This is the principle of the Atlantic Charter, the right of all peoples to choose the form of government which they will live. The resulting report stated that the three would assist occupied countries to form interim government that pledged the earliest possible establishment through free elections of the governments responsive to the will of the people, and to facilitate where necessary the holding of such elections. The agreement called on signatories to consult together with the measures necessary to discharge the joint responsibilities set forth in this declaration. During the Yalta discussions, Molotov inserted language that weakened the implication of enforcement of this declaration. Regarding Poland, the Yalta report further stated that the provisional government should be pledged to the holding of free and unfettered elections as soon as possible on the basis of universal suffrage and secret ballot. The agreement could not conceal the importance of ascending to a pro-Soviet short-term Lebanon government control and eliminating language that called for supervised elections. Gee, what a surprise. According to Roosevelt, if we attempt to evade the fact that we place somewhat more emphasis on the Lebanon Poles than the other 2 groups from which their new government is to be drawn, I feel we'll expose ourselves to the charges that we are attempting to go back to the Crimean decision. Roosevelt conceded that, in the words of Admiral William D. Leahy, the language of the Yalta was so vague that the Soviets could stretch it any way they want from Yalta to Washington without ever technically breaking it. The final agreement stipulated that the provisional government, for which is now functioning in Poland, should therefore be reorganized on a broader democratic basis with the inclusion of democratic leaders from Poland and from Poles abroad. The language of Yalta conceded predominance in the pro-Soviet Lebanon government and a provisional government, but a reorganized one. So basically they just kind of shook their heads and said, well, give them Poland.
This one.
Yeah. Now, on the aftermath token of crazy things that we talked about, because of Stalin's promises, Churchill believed that he would keep his word regarding Poland and remarked, poor Neville Chamberlain believed he could trust Hitler. He was wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong about Stalin. Churchill defended his actions at Yalta in a 3-day parliamentary debate starting on February 27th, which ended in a vote of confidence. During the debate, many MPs criticized Churchill and expressed deep reservations about Yalta and support for Poland, with 25 drafting an amendment protesting the agreement. After the Second World War ended, a communist government was installed in Poland. Many Poles felt betrayed by their wartime allies. Many Polish soldiers refused to go back to Poland because of the Soviet repressions of Polish citizens. The trial of the 16 and other executions of pro-Western Poles, particularly the former members of the AK or Arima Kartra. The result was the Polish Resettlement Act of 1947, Britain's first mass immigration law. Now, March 1st, 1945, Roosevelt assured Congress, I come from Crimea with the firm belief we have made a start on the road to the world of peace. However, Western powers soon realized that Stalin would not honor his promise of free elections for Poland. After receiving considerable criticism in London following Yalta regarding the atrocities committed in Poland by Soviet troops, Churchill wrote Roosevelt a desperate letter referencing the wholesale deportations and liquidations of opposition Poles by the Soviets. On March 11th, Roosevelt responded to Churchill, I most certainly agree that we must stand firm on the correct interpretation of the Crimean decision. You're quite correct in assuming that neither the government nor the people of this country will support participation in fraud or a mere whitewash of the Lebanon government, and the solution must be as we envisaged in Yalta. Now, by March 21st, Roosevelt's ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman, cabled Roosevelt that we must come clearly to realize the Soviet program is an establishment of totalitarianism, ending personal liberty and democracy as we know it. 2 days later, Roosevelt began to admit his view of Stalin had been excessively optimistic and that Averell is right. 4 days later, on March 27th, the Soviet People's Commissioner Commissariat for Internal Affairs, or the NKVD, arrested 16 Polish opposition political leaders who had been invited to participate in a provisional government negotiation. So basically, they set a trap and sprung it. The arrests were part of a trick employed by the NKVD, which flew the leaders to Moscow later for a show trial, followed by sentencing to a gulag. Yay! Churchill thereafter argued that that it was plain as a pikestaff that Moscow's tactics were to drag out the period for holding free elections while the Lebanon Committee consolidated their power. The Polish elections, held on January 16, 1947, resulted in Poland's official transformation to a communist state by 1949. Following Yalta, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov expressed worry that the Yalta Agreement's wording might impede Stalin's plans. Stalin responded, never mind, we'll do it our own way later. The Soviet Union had already annexed several occupied countries or into the Soviet Socialist republics, and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe were being occupied and converted into Soviet-controlled satellite states. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, and later, of course, East Germany. All of these became people's republics. Basically, these were dictatorships in disguise. Eventually, the United States and the United Kingdom made concessions in recognizing the communist-dominated regions by sacrificing the substance of the Yalta Declaration, although it remained in form. Now, at some point early in 1945, Churchill had commissioned a contingency military enforcement operation plan for war on the Soviet Union to obtain a square deal for Poland, creatively enough named Operation Unthinkable.
They thought of it, didn't they?
Yeah, they thought of it and decided that in a May 22nd report that stated unfavorable success odds. The report's argument included a geostrategic issues, possible Soviet-Japanese alliance, resulting in the moving of Japanese troops from the Asian continent to the home islands, threats to Iran and Iraq, and uncertainties concerning land battles in Europe. Then later on, as mentioned earlier, the Potsdam Conference would take place in July to August of 1945, which included the participation of Clement Attlee after Churchill had been replaced as Prime Minister, and President Arias Truman after Roosevelt's death. And in Potsdam, the Soviets denied claims that they're interfering in the affairs of Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. You mean capturing opposition leaders and putting them in gulags is not interfering? What a concept. The conference resulted in the Potsdam Declaration regarding the surrender of Japan and the Potsdam Agreement regarding the Soviet annexation of former Polish territory east of the Curzon Line, provisions to be addressed in the eventual final treaty ending World War II, and the annexation of parts of Germany east of the Oder-Neisse line into Poland and the northern eastern Prussia into the Soviet Union. Now, Roosevelt's generous terms to Stalin followed quite quickly by the start of the Cold War under Roosevelt's vice president and successor, Harry Truman, meant that Yalta was often seen in a bad light by American public opinion, particularly among the shades of Republicans and more conservative Democrats in the South and West, as well as many Americans with links to Eastern Europe. While Eisenhower was elected as president on the Republican ticket, there were hopes that Yalta would be repudiated by the new administration and newly Republican Senate. Efforts were made by both the Senate Majority Leader Robert A. Taft and Republican members of the Foreign Relations Committee, although this fizzled out after Stalin passed away.
Yeah.
But as things went, yeah, it kind of set the table. I mean, it's one of those cases where if this would have worked how it was supposed to work, but because they made it so vague, Stalin was basically given a green light to go take over Eastern Europe. Yeah. But yeah, this was officially the end of the Yalta Conference in 1945. And I still say I feel that the Poles got ripped off.
I feel like everybody got ripped off.
Pretty much.
Because we made a bunch of agreements and then we stick to them as usual.
Yeah, we stuck to them.
For once.
Stalin did, yeah. So,
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Lord, I apologize. Youth Pigs and Boogie came in. But this has been the Bearded Historian for another Wayback Wednesday. If Sue doesn't beat me up, throw me out, and I cry. We will see you guys next week. Have a good one.
34, almost 45.